In most of the United States, there is no law that requires a customer to leave a tip. A server cannot have a customer arrested for walking out after leaving nothing on the table. And yet, across the country, tipping is treated as something close to an obligation, with a specific expected percentage, social pressure attached to skipping it, and, in some cases, an amount added to the bill automatically before the customer ever picks up a pen. Servers and bartenders in much of the country are also paid a direct hourly wage well below the standard minimum wage, on the assumption that tips will cover the rest, which means the discretionary act of tipping is quietly propping up a large share of many workers' actual paychecks. Understanding how tipping went from a discretionary gesture to something that functions, in practice, as mandatory requires tracing a specific chain of laws, court rulings, and lobbying decisions that stretches back more than a century and a half. Tipping did not originate in America. Its roots trace back to England, where, as early as the 16th century, wealthy travelers staying at a friend's country home would leave money for the household servants, a payment known as a vail, intended to compensate staff for the extra work of hosting a guest. The custom grew quickly enough that household servants came to expect, and in some cases openly demand, these payments from any visiting guest, a shift that historians researching the period have described as a growing source of irritation for the travelers footing the bill. Over time, the custom spread from private homes into taverns and coffee houses, becoming an expected part of English social life among the upper classes by the 1700s. A popular story claims the word tip comes from an acronym on collection bowls in Old English coffee houses, standing for to ensure promptness. Most linguists who have studied the term consider this a colorful myth rather than documented fact. They trace the word instead to older slang meaning simply to give or to hand over. Whatever its exact linguistic origin, by the late 1700s and early 1800s, tipping was a firmly established European custom, tied closely to class distinctions between wealthy patrons and the servants who worked for them. Wealthy Americans encountered this custom directly while traveling through Europe in the 1850s and 1860s. Many saw it as a marker of worldliness and sophistication, a way to demonstrate they understood the customs of the aristocratic circles they had visited abroad. When they returned home, some began tipping in American hotels and restaurants as a way of performing that same sense of refinement. But the practice did not arrive to a warm welcome. Many working-class and middle-class Americans viewed it as an affront to the country's founding democratic ideals, an import that recreated European class hierarchy on American soil. Why, critics asked, should an ordinary person be expected to pay extra, on top of an already set price, simply to receive the service they were already owed? The custom took firmer hold in America in the decades following the Civil War, and this is where the story shifts from a matter of imported etiquette to a matter of labor economics. Around this time, the American hotel and hospitality industry was transforming. Hotels had traditionally operated under what was called the American plan, charging one all-inclusive rate that covered room, meals, and service together, often provided by staff who were effectively part of an extended household operation. As the industry expanded, many hotels and restaurants shifted to the European plan, charging separately for rooms, food, and service, and increasingly staffing that service with paid employees who were not part of any household at all. This restructuring coincided almost exactly with the end of slavery and the entry of millions of newly freed Black Americans into the paid labor market, seeking work in precisely the hotel, railroad, and restaurant industries that were undergoing this shift. Employers in these industries saw a clear financial opportunity. Rather than paying full wages to this large new pool of available workers, some businesses began paying little or nothing directly, and instead relying on customers to compensate staff through tips. One of the most frequently cited examples of this arrangement is the Pullman Company, which operated railroad sleeping cars across the country and became, for a time, the single largest private employer of Black Americans in the United States. Pullman porters were long expected to rely heavily on passenger tips to supplement wages that were, on their own, far below what the work demanded. The dependency became so central to the job that it eventually became a direct point of labor organizing. In 1925, Pullman porters formed the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters under the leadership of labor organizer Philip Randolph, one of the first labor unions in the country led by Black Americans, and one of its central demands over the following decade was a livable direct wage that did not leave workers dependent on the generosity of individual passengers just to get by. This was not an isolated business decision by one railroad company. It reflected a broader pattern across the hospitality and railroad industries in the decades after emancipation, where tipping offered a convenient way to shift the cost of labor away from the employer and onto the customer, precisely at the moment when the newly freed workforce had the least leverage to negotiate for a full, direct wage. This economic dimension did not go unnoticed at the time, and it helped fuel a genuine, organized backlash against tipping in the early 20th century. Critics, including labor reformers and social commentators, argued that tipping created an undemocratic, servile relationship between customer and worker that had no place in American life. Groups calling themselves anti-tipping societies formed in several cities, with members pledging never to give or accept a gratuity, treating the pledge as a small act of civic resistance rather than simple personal frugality. In 1916, writer and activist William R. Scott published a book-length attack on the practice titled The Itching Palm. It described the tipper-tipped relationship in stark terms, calling the custom, in one frequently cited phrase, democracy's deadly foe. A New York Times piece around the same period went further, describing tipping as viciously un-American. This was not a fringe position, and it was not confined to labor circles alone. It drew support from a wider swath of the middle class, who resented being expected to pay extra, on top of an already fixed price, for service they felt they had already purchased. Between roughly 1909 and the mid-1920s, 6 states passed laws banning tipping outright: Washington, Arkansas, Iowa, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia. In some framings of the era, these laws treated a gratuity handed to a worker as a form of unlawful, undocumented compensation the employer was attempting to avoid paying directly. The movement, however, did not last. Several factors combined to end it. The onset of the First World War shifted public attention toward the war effort and away from domestic social reform campaigns like this one, as newspapers, civic groups, and everyday conversation turned to rationing, conscription, and the fighting overseas rather than the etiquette of the dining room. At the same time, the restaurant and hospitality industry pushed back hard, arguing that tipping had become structurally embedded in how their businesses operated and set prices, and that removing it abruptly would require either raising menu prices or raising base wages in ways owners were unwilling to accept. State anti-tipping laws were gradually challenged in court or simply repealed by state legislatures under industry pressure, and by the early 1920s, most of the 6 original bans had been undone. By the end of that decade, the practice that critics had called un-American just 10 years earlier had become a permanent, largely unquestioned fixture of American service industries, and the anti-tipping societies that had once organized public pledges against it had largely disappeared from public life. The next major turning point came with the New Deal. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established the country's first federal minimum wage, initially set at 25 cents an hour, roughly equivalent to $5 and change in today's dollars once adjusted for inflation, along with the standard 40-hour workweek and a ban on child labor. It was one of the signature labor achievements of the Roosevelt administration. But the law, as originally written, covered only a portion of the American workforce, by some estimates well under half of all working Americans at the time, and it explicitly excluded entire categories of workers from its protections, including those in restaurants, hotels, and other service occupations, along with agricultural and domestic workers. Labor historians who have examined the legislative history of that law point out that these specific exclusions lined up closely with the industries that, at the time, employed a disproportionate share of Black American workers, particularly in the South. They argue that the carve-outs were, at least in part, a political concession made to secure the votes of Southern members of Congress who support the broader New Deal legislation needed. Whatever the precise mix of motivations, the practical effect was the same. Workers in tipped industries were left outside federal minimum wage protection entirely for nearly 3 decades, during exactly the period when tipping was becoming permanently entrenched as their primary source of income. A smaller but still notable legal development came in 1942, when the Supreme Court ruled that a tip, once given, belongs to the employee who received it, not the employer, establishing at least a baseline worker protection around gratuities, even while tipped workers still had no minimum wage floor at all. That ruling addressed ownership of a tip after it was given. It did nothing to address whether a tipped worker was earning enough, in total, to live on in the first place, a question federal law would not touch for another 24 years. That changed in 1966, when Congress amended the Fair Labor Standards Act to finally bring tipped workers, along with several other previously excluded groups, under federal minimum wage coverage. This should have closed the gap opened up in 1938. Instead, the same amendment created a new mechanism that preserved much of the old arrangement in a different form, the tip credit. Under this system, employers were permitted to pay tipped workers a lower direct cash wage than the standard minimum, on the assumption that tips would make up the difference. The original version of this system split the obligation roughly in half. Employers had to pay at least 50% of the regular minimum wage in direct cash, with the tip credit covering the rest, and this cash wage floor was adjusted upward each time Congress raised the overall minimum wage. That link between the tipped cash wage and the regular minimum wage held for about 25 years. In 1991, as the standard federal minimum wage rose to $4.25 an hour, the required direct cash wage for tipped workers was set at $2.13. Then, in 1996, when Congress next moved to raise the regular minimum wage, the National Restaurant Association, the hospitality industry's main lobbying organization, led at the time by future presidential candidate Herman Cain, successfully negotiated a deal that decoupled the tipped cash wage from any future minimum wage increases entirely. In exchange for the industry's support of a higher standard minimum wage, tipped workers' cash wage was frozen at $2.13 an hour, indefinitely, regardless of how much the regular minimum wage might rise afterward. It has not moved since. The standard federal minimum wage has been raised several times since 1991, most recently to $7.25 an hour in 2009, where it remains as of this recording. The federal tipped cash wage, by contrast, has stayed at $2.13 for well over 3 decades, one of the longest wage freezes of any kind in American labor law. In practical terms, this means a tipped worker's employer is only legally required to pay $2.13 in direct wages per hour, with the remaining $5.12 needed to reach the $7.25 floor expected to come from customer tips. The National Restaurant Association's role in this specific outcome is not a matter of speculation. It is documented in the legislative record of the 1996 minimum wage debate, and labor researchers who track the organization sometimes refer to it informally as the other NRA, distinguishing it from the National Rifle Association while pointing to a similar reputation for disciplined, effective lobbying relative to its size. The organization has continued to play an active role in tipped wage policy in the years since, including its involvement in the more recent Washington, D.C. and Michigan disputes described above. This is not to say the organization acts alone or without any legitimate business rationale. Restaurant margins are famously thin. The industry's basic argument, that a sudden, large increase in fixed labor costs could force price increases or closures, is a genuine economic concern shared by many small, independent restaurant owners who are members of the association, not solely a matter of protecting large corporate interests. But it does mean that, whenever federal or state legislators have proposed raising the tipped minimum wage over the past 3 decades, they have consistently done so against a well-organized, well-funded, and largely successful opposition. The law does include a backstop. If a tipped worker's combined wages and tips fall short of the full minimum wage in a given pay period, the employer is legally required to make up the difference out of pocket. Consider a server working a 5-hour shift at the federal tipped cash wage, earning $10 in tips over that shift. Their direct wages for those 5 hours would total $10.65. Combined with tips, that comes to $20.65, well short of the $36.25 that 5 hours at the full minimum wage would require. By law, the employer owes that server the remaining $15.60. In practice, enforcement of this backstop has been inconsistent. A U.S. Department of Labor review of more than 9,000 restaurants between 2010 and 2012 found that 84% had some form of wage and hour violation, including 1,200 violations specifically tied to improper use of the tip credit. The legal protection exists on paper. Whether an individual worker actually receives it in practice depends heavily on employer compliance and enforcement, neither of which is guaranteed. One more federal change is worth noting before turning to how individual states have handled this differently. In March 2018, Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which amended the Fair Labor Standards Act's tip provisions in two significant ways. First, it explicitly barred employers, managers, and supervisors from keeping any portion of an employee's tips for any purpose, regardless of whether that employer uses the tip credit, closing a loophole that had allowed some tip theft at the management level. Second, it permitted restaurants to include traditionally non-tipped back-of-house workers, such as cooks, bussers, and dishwashers, in a shared tip pool alongside servers and bartenders, but only on the condition that the restaurant does not take the tip credit at all, meaning every worker in that pool must already be receiving the full minimum wage in direct cash. In effect, Congress offered restaurants a choice. Keep the lower tipped cash wage and the tip credit, with tips reserved only for traditionally tipped staff, or pay everyone the full minimum wage directly and gain the flexibility to share tips more broadly across the kitchen and the floor. Not every state follows the federal model. As of the current law, 7 states, including California, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Alaska, Montana, and Minnesota, have eliminated the tip credit entirely, requiring employers to pay tipped workers the full state minimum wage before any tips are counted at all. This is not a recent or trendy policy shift in every one of these states. California's state labor code has required employers to pay tipped workers the full state minimum wage, with tips treated as fully separate from that obligation, since long before terms like one fair wage existed as a branded advocacy campaign. That history makes California one of the longest-running real-world tests of what happens to a restaurant industry when the tip credit is simply never allowed in the first place. Washington, D.C. voted in 2022 to phase out its own tipped subminimum wage gradually, with full elimination scheduled by 2027. But these state-level victories have not come easily or without industry resistance. Even after voters in Washington, D.C. and Michigan approved ballot measures to end their tipped subminimum wage systems, sustained lobbying from the restaurant industry led lawmakers in both places to significantly delay or water down those changes after the fact, a pattern that mirrors, almost exactly, the industry pushback that unraveled the anti-tipping laws of the 1910s. This ongoing fight over the tipped subminimum wage remains an active, contested policy debate, with organized advocates on both sides. Groups like One Fair Wage, led by longtime labor researcher and advocate Suraj Raman, argue the federal tip credit should be eliminated everywhere, pointing to Department of Labor enforcement data showing widespread violations, and to the wage's racial and historical origins, as reasons the current system fails the workers it is supposed to protect. Advocates on this side of the debate also frequently point out that tipped restaurant workers in the United States are disproportionately women, roughly 70% of the tipped workforce by some labor estimates. They argue that a wage structure requiring workers to secure adequate pay through customer goodwill carries added risk for a predominantly female workforce, including exposure to harassment from customers whose tips they depend on. The National Restaurant Association and many individual restaurant owners argue the opposite, contending that eliminating the tip credit would force many restaurants, which typically operate on thin profit margins, to raise menu prices substantially to cover the higher guaranteed wages, potentially reducing customer traffic and, in turn, employee hours. Some servers themselves, particularly at higher volume or higher-end restaurants where tip income can significantly exceed the standard minimum wage, have also voiced concern that eliminating tipping altogether, as opposed to just raising the base wage, could lower their total take-home pay if it leads restaurants to reduce or eliminate tipping in favor of a flat service charge instead. The 7 states that have already eliminated the tip credit provide some real-world data on this question, but economists and industry groups continue to disagree on how to interpret the effects on restaurant pricing, employment levels, and worker earnings in those states compared to the rest of the country. All of this explains why tipping functions as something close to an economic necessity for many American service workers, and why customers often feel a real obligation to tip even without any law commanding it directly. But there is one specific, narrow situation in American commerce where tipping actually does become legally mandatory, and it is worth explaining precisely, because it marks the one place where the practice crosses from social expectation into enforceable requirement. Many restaurants, for years, added an automatic gratuity, commonly 18 to 20%, to the bills of large parties, often defined as parties of 6 or more. For a long time, these automatic charges were treated by the IRS the same way as any other tip. That changed with a formal IRS ruling issued in 2012, which took effect on January 1, 2014. Under this ruling, the IRS established a four-part test to determine whether a payment genuinely counts as a discretionary tip. The customer must be free not to pay it. The customer must have unrestricted discretion over the amount. The amount must not be set or negotiated by the business itself, and the customer must generally have the right to decide who receives it. An automatic gratuity added to a large party's bill fails every one of these tests. The customer cannot decline it, does not set the amount, and has no say in who it goes to. As a result, the IRS reclassified these automatic charges as service charges, not tips, meaning they are treated as regular employee wages subject to standard payroll tax withholding rather than tip income. This reclassification carries real consequences on both sides of the transaction. For the restaurant, it means the automatic gratuity no longer qualifies for the tip credit, so the employer must pay standard minimum wage, in full, for the hours associated with that service, and must withhold and pay employment taxes on the amount just as it would for any other wage. For the customer, the effect is more direct, because this charge is legally categorized as a mandatory service charge rather than a discretionary tip. The customer genuinely cannot refuse to pay it. Declining to pay an automatic gratuity that has been properly applied to a bill is treated, legally, the same as declining to pay for the meal itself. This is the one place in the American tipping system where the word mandatory is not a matter of social pressure or economic dependency. It is a matter of enforceable law, precisely because the payment has been legally redefined as something other than a tip. A concrete example makes the distinction easier to see. Imagine a party of 10 at a restaurant whose menu states that an automatic 18% gratuity applies to parties of 8 or more. If the bill comes to $400, that policy adds $72 to the total, a fixed, non-negotiable figure the restaurant itself set in advance. Under the IRS's four-part test, this fails on every count. The diners cannot opt out, cannot adjust the $72 figure up or down, did not negotiate the percentage, and have no say in how it is distributed among staff. Legally, this is indistinguishable from a corkage fee or a delivery charge. It is part of the price of the meal, not a voluntary reward layered on top of it. Compare that to a smaller table of 2, given a receipt with suggested tip buttons for 18, 20, and 25% alongside a blank line for a custom amount. Even though the restaurant is actively nudging that second table toward a specific figure, the diners remain legally free to write in $1 or nothing without violating any obligation. Both situations involve a restaurant strongly encouraging a specific payment. Only one of them is legally enforceable. Ironically, this 2014 rule change led many restaurants to abandon automatic gratuities altogether, rather than absorb the added tax and wage obligations that came with them. Some replaced the practice with suggested, non-binding tip percentages printed directly on the receipt, an approach that preserves the customer's legal discretion and therefore keeps the payment classified as an actual tip, while still nudging them toward a specific amount through the power of suggestion rather than legal obligation. Beyond the legal mechanics of wages and service charges, a more recent, entirely social shift has reinforced just how mandatory tipping can feel in everyday life, even where no law is involved at all. Since the COVID-19 pandemic and the inflation that followed it, digital point-of-sale systems, the touchscreen tablets and handheld card readers now common at coffee shops, food trucks, and retail counters, have built-in prompts that ask customers to select a tip percentage before completing almost any transaction, often defaulting to 18, 20, or 25%, regardless of whether any table service was involved at all. These prompts have spread well beyond restaurants, showing up at self-checkout kiosks, online retail purchases, and even charitable crowdfunding platforms, situations that had no tipping convention at all just a few years earlier. Researchers and the public alike have taken to calling this trend tip creep or tipflation. A Pew Research Center survey of nearly 12,000 American adults found that 72% said tipping felt expected in more places than it had just 5 years earlier. 29% said they now viewed tipping as an obligation rather than a genuine choice. And 26% said they found it genuinely difficult to figure out whether a tip was expected in a given situation at all. A separate Bankrate survey found that roughly 2/3 of Americans held a negative view of tipping overall, with about 30% describing the current culture around it as out of control, and nearly a third saying they felt annoyed specifically by preset tip screens. None of these digital prompts are legally binding in the way an automatic large party gratuity is. A customer can almost always select a custom amount, enter zero, or skip the prompt entirely. But the design of these systems, combined with the simple social pressure of choosing an amount while a worker stands within view, has made many customers feel that declining or reducing the suggested amount carries a real social cost, even when it carries no legal one. This is, in a sense, the newest chapter of the same story that has run through this entire history. A business practice that shifts the underlying cost of paying workers onto the customer. This time, it is reinforced not through a specific statute, but through the design of the checkout screen itself, and the discomfort most people feel saying no to a request made directly in front of another human being. There is a final irony worth noting in how this history has played out on both sides of the Atlantic. Tipping arrived in America as an import from European aristocratic custom in the mid-1800s. But American resistance to the practice in the late 1800s and early 1900s was significant enough that, according to some accounts, anti-tipping sentiment spread back across the Atlantic and contributed to Europe's own gradual move away from mandatory gratuities in many countries. Today, in much of Western Europe, service charges are commonly built directly into the listed price, and tipping beyond that is modest or optional. The country that borrowed the custom from Europe in the first place ended up keeping it far more firmly embedded in its economy than the countries it borrowed it from. Put together, the real reason tipping in America feels mandatory is not any single law commanding a customer to pay a specific percentage. It is the layered result of several distinct decisions made across more than a century. It began with a post-Civil War labor system that let hotel, railroad, and restaurant employers shift wage costs onto customers, precisely when a newly freed workforce had the least bargaining power to resist it. It continued with a New Deal minimum wage law that, in 1938, explicitly excluded those same industries from coverage, and a 1966 amendment that finally extended coverage but preserved the underlying arrangement through the tip credit. It was locked into place by a 1991 and 1996 sequence of political deals, brokered directly by the restaurant industry's lobbying arm, that froze the tipped cash wage for more than 3 decades even as the regular minimum wage continued to rise. And it is reinforced today by a narrow but real legal category, automatic and mandatory service charges, where a gratuity genuinely does become a non-optional, legally enforceable payment. And, most recently, by a wave of digital payment technology that has extended the social pressure to tip into places it never used to exist, without any new law requiring it at all. None of these pieces happened by accident. Each one can be traced to a specific law, court ruling, or negotiated agreement, most of them a matter of public record. For the ordinary solo diner leaving a standard tip on a normal-sized check, the law has never technically required them to leave anything at all. But the economic system surrounding that diner, built deliberately and reinforced repeatedly over more than a century, and now extended further by the technology sitting on the counter in front of them, was constructed so that, in practice, it would feel like they had no real choice.